Richard Stallman is the founding father of the free software movement. Through his efforts to build the GNU operating system, he created the legal, philosophical, and technological foundation for the free software movement. Without these contributions, it's unlikely that Linux and open source would have evolved into their current forms today.
I joined the MIT Artificial Intelligence Lab in 1971. I joined a thriving community of hackers, people who loved programming, loved exploring what they could do with computers, and they had developed a complete operating system, entirely written there. And I became one of the team that continued to improve the operating system, adding new capabilities. That was my job, and I loved it. We all loved it. That's why we were doing it. And we called our system the incompatible time-sharing system, which is an example of the playful spirit which defines a hacker. Hackers are people who enjoy playful cleverness. Well, it first started going wrong as the outside world started pressuring us to have passwords. We didn't have any passwords on our computer. And the reason was that the hackers who'd originally designed the system realized that passwords were a way that the administrators could control all the users. And they didn't want to build tools, locks and keys for the administrators to control them. So they just didn't do it. They left that out. And we had the philosophy that whoever's sitting at the computer should be able to do whatever he wants, and somebody else who was there yesterday shouldn't be controlling what you do today. When they put passwords onto one of the machines at MIT, I and a bunch of other hackers didn't like it. I decided to try a subversive sort of hack. I figured out how to decode the passwords. So by looking at the database of encoded passwords, I could figure out what each person would actually type to log in. And so I sent messages to people saying, hello, I see that you've chosen the password mumble, or whatever it was. How about if you do as I do? Just type enter for your password. It's much shorter, much easier to type. And of course, with this message, I was implicitly telling them that the security was really just a joke anyway. But in addition, I was letting them in on this hack. And eventually, a fifth of all the users on that computer joined me in using just enter as their passwords.
In the late 70s and early 1980s, Richard Stallman was doing artificial intelligence research and coding at the MIT Artificial Intelligence Lab. Richard had a number of negative experiences during that period which soured him on the whole idea of commercial software.
Such as?
Some code that he wanted to work on and wanted to fix was locked up, and he couldn't get the company that owned the code to let him fix it, even though it would have been to their advantage to do so.
And that put me into a moral dilemma, you see, because to get one of the modern computers of the day, which was the early 80s, you would have to get a proprietary operating system. The developers of those systems didn't share with other people. Instead, they tried to control the users, dominate the users, restrict them, saying, if to get this system, you have to sign a promise you won't share with anybody else. And to me, that was essentially a promise to be a bad person, to betray the rest of the world, cut myself off from society, from the cooperating community. And I had already experienced what happened when other people did that to us, when they refused to share with us because they had signed these contracts. And it hurt the whole lab, kept us from doing useful things before. So I just wasn't going to do that. I felt, this is wrong. I am not going to live this way.
And from experiences like this, he developed a profound hostility to the idea of intellectual property in software. He eventually acted this out by founding the Free Software Foundation.
So I looked for another alternative, and I realized I was an operating system developer. If I were to develop another operating system, and then as the author, encourage everyone to share it, say, everyone, you can come and get it, use this, form a new community, not only could I give myself a way to keep using computers without betraying other people, but I'd give it to everybody else too. Everybody would have a way out of that moral dilemma. And so I realized this was what I had to do with my life. I actually began the project in January of 1984. That's when I resigned from my job at MIT to start developing the GNU operating system. Now, I should explain that the name GNU is a hack because it's a recursive acronym. It stands for GNU's not Unix. You see, so the G in GNU stands for GNU. And what the name means is I was developing a system that was like the Unix operating system, but was not the Unix operating system. This was a different system. We would have to write it completely from scratch because Unix was proprietary. We were forbidden to share Unix. We couldn't use Unix. It was useless for a community. So we had to write a replacement for it.
Throughout the 1980s, as Richard Stallman was building the GNU project, computer scientists from the University of California at Berkeley were developing their own free operating system. Known as Berkeley Unix, or BSD, it was based upon the Unix kernel which had been licensed from AT&T. However, due to legal problems with AT&T and fragmentation of the source code, hackers and other non-institutional users were slow to adopt it.
Well, Unix consisted of a large number of separate programs that communicated with each other. So we just had to replace these programs one by one. So what I started doing was writing a replacement for one program, and then another, and then another, and then people started joining me because I published an announcement inviting other people to join me to help write these programs. And by around 1991, we had replaced practically all of them.
What were some of the programs that you
Well, we had to have a complete system, you need to have a kernel, which is the program that allocates resources to all the other programs. You need a compiler, which translates a program from readable source code that programmers can understand into numbers, mysterious numbers that the computer can actually run. You need other programs that go with the compiler to help do this job. You need a debugger, you need a text editor, you need text formatter, you need mailers, you need lots and lots of things. There are hundreds of programs in a Unix-like operating system.
I saw Stallman's announcement. Actually, I met him in February of 1987. He came to give a 5-day tutorial on Emacs at our company. And during the day, he would explain new ways to think about Emacs and ways to extend and enhance it and to use the Emacs source code for better or worse. But in the evening, he was busily working on this compiler, and he had not yet released it to the public, so he was being a little bit careful about who got to see the source code. But I was very eager, and when he first announced it in June, I downloaded it immediately. I played with it. I got some pointers from him, and when I sent the source code back to him, he was very actually amazed at how quickly I was able to ramp up on his technology.
Whenever we worked on something at Stanford or in the university, we would get, mostly at the time we were working off of machines from Digital Equipment or Sun, mostly Sun. Whenever we would get a Sun machine, the first thing we would do is we would spend literally days downloading GNU free software from the internet, building it and installing it on that Sun machine.
The crucial thing about GNU is that it's free software. Now, free software refers not to price, but to freedom. So think of free speech, not free beer. The freedoms that I'm talking about are the freedoms to make changes if you want to, or hire somebody else to make changes for you if you're using the software for your business, to redistribute copies, to share with other people, and to make improvements and publish them so that other people can get the benefit of them too. Now, those are the freedoms that distinguish free software from non-free software. These are the freedoms that enable people to form a community. If you don't have all these freedoms, you're being divided and dominated by somebody.
My first experience contributing to free software came in late 1989, early 1990. I was working as a graduate student at Stanford University on computer-aided design tools. One of the pieces I needed was a tool called a parser generator. Well, the Free Software Foundation under Richard Stallman had created a great tool called Bison. I needed a tool that worked with C++. Bison worked with C. I modified Bison to create something called Bison++. And it was a tremendous feeling of empowerment to be able to take a piece of software that was available and create what you needed in a very short piece of time by modifying it.
I put it back on the internet, and I was amazed at the number of people that picked it up and started using it. In fact, I remember going to job interviews. I at various times considered just going out and getting a job, and I'd gone to a job interview, and I was talking with one of the people, and I started asking them about what tools they used, and they said, gee, we use Bison++. And I said, oh, I'm the author of Bison++.
Free software generally does have a copyright, it does have an owner, and it has a license. It is not public domain.
If we put the software in the public domain, somebody else would be able to make a little bit of changes and turn that into a proprietary software package, which means that the users would be running our software, but they wouldn't have freedom to cooperate and share. To prevent that, we use a technique called copyleft. The idea of copyleft is that it's copyright flipped over. And what we do is we say, this software is copyrighted, and we, the authors, give you permission to redistribute copies. So we give you permission to change it. We give you permission to add to it. But when you redistribute it, it has to be under these terms, no more and no less, so that whoever gets it from you also gets the freedom to cooperate with other people if he wants to. And then in this way, everywhere the software goes, the freedom goes too, and it becomes an inalienable right to cooperate with other people and form a community.
And so what is that, the license? What is that?
Well, copyleft being a general idea, in order to use it, you have to have a specific example. And the specific example we use for most GNU software packages is the GNU General Public License, a particular document in legalese which accomplishes this job. A lot of other people use that same license. For example, Linus Torvalds uses that license for Linux as well.
Well, the license I use is the GNU General Public License. That's the one that Richard Stallman wrote, and I think it's a really astounding contribution. It's one of the few software licenses that was written from the standpoint of the community rather than from the standpoint of protecting a company or, as is the case with the MIT and the BSD license, performing the goals of a government grant program. And the GPL is really unique in that it's not just a license, it's a whole philosophy that I think motivated the open source definition. I don't hide that a lot of what I do came from Stallman.
A crucial step in the growth of GNU, Linux, and the free software movement was the creation of businesses based upon the software and philosophy. Ground zero for the beginning of the business phase was the Electronics Research Lab at Stanford University. Known as ERL, the lab was the place where the first GNU and Linux businesses found their inspiration.
So right here is where ERL was. That would have been the entrance over there next to the Electrical Engineering McCullough building. So you walk in, you come in, you walk down the hallway down here. My office would have been about here. And then right across the hall from that was Michael Tieman's office.
Michael Tiemann took and started a company, Cygnus Software, but the idea was to sell consulting and services around the GNU free software. And, well, Michael's done very well with Cygnus.
Well, I spent a lot of time working out how we were going to make money, and in the original GNU Manifesto, which is the last chapter of the GNU Emacs manual, Stallman proposed a number of different possible ways to make money.
From the beginning of the free software movement, I've had the idea that there's room in it for business to be done. One of the advantages of free software is that there's a free market for any kind of service or support. So if you are using software in your business and you want good support, you have a choice of people to go to for it. You have a choice of businesses that are in the business of providing you with support. So they're going to have to, in general, give you good support or you'll go to somebody else. With proprietary software, support is a monopoly. There's one company, typically, that has the source code, and only they can give you support. So typically, you're at the mercy of a monopoly. That's the case, for example, with Microsoft. So no wonder the support is so bad.
The benefits of free software were tremendous, but the cost of supporting it internally made managers very, very nervous. And so the fundamental idea I had was if we could build a model that could deliver 2 to 4 times list of support and hand-holding capability that an internal engineer could provide, and we could do it at 1/2 to 1/4 of the cost, that would meet the test of whether or not people would actually buy. And by about the fall of that year, we had all of the things worked out about who we needed on the technical team, what the terms of the sale would be, what the key price points were, and we actually received our incorporation in November of 1989. One of the most difficult things in starting our company was actually finding a name for it. I explained this to one of my friends. We were having difficulty, and he returned an email message that basically just had a bunch of words with the name GNU in it. And Cygnus was the one that looked least obnoxious and least obscene.
I can say very clearly that Cygnus was the first business that specialized in free software. Cygnus supported free software, filled a very essential niche because we had this great software. You could get it for nothing, but you couldn't get support, and they made their money by charging for support.
The GNU project started by building a toolkit of basic development tools such as a C compiler, a debugger, a text editor, and other necessary apparatus. And their intention was eventually to develop a kernel to sit underneath those and be the center of the operating system. By about 1990, they had successfully developed that toolkit, and it was in wide use on a great many variants of Unix, but there was still no free kernel.
The kernel happened to be one of the last things we started to do, and we had started it not long before. And that's when Linus Torvalds came along.
Linus or Linus? What's your preferred pronunciation?
When I speak Swedish, it's Linus. When I speak Finnish, it's Linus. When I speak English, it's Linus. And I really don't care how people pronounce my name. But Linux is always Linux.
He developed a kernel and got it working faster than we got ours working, and got it to work very nicely and solidly. His kernel is called Linux.
The initial goal was my very personal goal, to be able to run a similar environment on my computer that I had grown used to at the university computers. And I could not find anything that suited me for that, right? So having been doing computers for all my life, basically, at that point I just decided that I'll do my own. Most of the inspiration early on came from Sun OS, which was what I was using at the university at the time.
Which university?
University of Helsinki in Finland.
From 1991 to about 1993 was really, I guess, the infancy period of Linux. That was when it was still only alpha or beta quality. It was relatively unstable, although even then it was a good deal more stable than a lot of what are now called production operating systems.
Linus used the traditional tried and true method of writing one program that does the job, and he got it to work quickly, in fact, faster than I would have thought was possible.
The term for it is monolithic, which means that basically the OS itself is one entity, indivisible, while in a microkernel, the operating system kernel is actually just a collection of servers that do different things, and then they have a common protocol for doing communication between themselves.
So why is it that if the GNU project had so much lead time, so to speak, doing this, why is it that he was able to kind of come in at the tail end,
Well,
so to speak?
we actually started the GNU herd not long before he started Linux. And as it happened, though, we chose a design that's a very advanced design in terms of the power it gives you, but also turns out to be very hard to debug. We decided to divide up the kernel, which traditionally had been one program, to divide it up into a lot of smaller programs that would send messages to each other asynchronously to communicate. And the problem is that that style of programming has a great deal of potential for bugs, which are often very hard to figure out because they depend on, does this program send this message before or after this one sends that message? And the result was, it took us years to get the thing to work.
What is Linux's relationship to the GNU project?
Well, there's there's relationships to GNU on kind of multiple levels. One is just the philosophical level of thinking that making your source open is a good idea.
When Linus developed the kernel, he wasn't doing it for the GNU project. He did it independently. And he released it independently, and we didn't know about it, but some of the people who did know about it decided to look for what else they could find to put together with that kernel to make a whole system. And they looked around, and lo and behold, everything they needed was already available. What good fortune, they thought, but actually there was no chance about it. They had found all the pieces of the GNU system, which was missing just the kernel. So when they put all that together, really they were fitting Linux into the gap in the GNU system, but they didn't know that.
There's a lot of these programs done by the Free Software Foundation and done by other people like Linux, and there's a symbiosis between Linux and the programs, so that the programs run on Linux and at the same time, and they take advantage of Linux as a platform, while Linux takes advantage of the programs by just being able to use them.
What programs?
For the main one is actually the GNU C compiler, which without a C compiler it would not have been possible to make Linux or most of the open programs available. Linux uses the GPL, and I agree with the kind of philosophy behind the GPL. That said, the GPL itself is not a very pretty document, which is probably just because no lawyers can ever be very pretty.
Well, I'd been playing around with Linux for actually late 92, early 93 for about a year before I decided it was to the point where it actually had everything that I needed to really replace the Sun workstation.
And I was looking for a way to have a Unix workstation at home. At the time, we used Sun Spark stations in the office at Stanford. Those machines cost us about $7,000. Now, I desperately wanted a Unix machine at home.
There's always this thought you get as a graduate student, gee, if I could work at home, then I would be so much more productive. I would graduate sooner because I would finish my thesis sooner. Well, is it true? Well, you can judge, you know. Most people end up spending a lot of their time becoming more productive so that if they ever actually worked on their thesis, they'd finish it in a day. It takes a while sometimes. So I decided I wanted a Unix machine at home. And I went out there and was able to use Linux together with a PC. For about $2,000, I put together a system
that was 1.5 to 2 times faster than that $7,000 Sun Spark station. That was absolutely amazing. I had 1.5 to 2 times the speed at 1/3 to 1/4 the price. Light bulbs went off. I knew there was an opportunity here. This was a chance to really do something better than what Sun has done around open source and Linux.
I called it Linux originally as a working name, and that was just because Linus, and the X has to be there. It's Unix. I mean, it's like a law. And what happened was that I initially thought that I can't call it Linux publicly because it's just too egotistical. And that was before I had a big ego, right?
They thought they were taking a whole bunch of components and putting them around Linux. So they ended up calling the whole thing a Linux system, and somehow that term caught on. And the result is there are now 10 million people using this variant of the GNU system, the GNU/Linux operating system, and most of them don't know it. Well, since the first 3 recipients have spoken for the open source movement, I think I should speak about the free software movement. The open source movement focuses on practical advantages that you can get by having a community of users who can cooperate on interchanging and improving software. I agree completely with the points they make about that. The reason why my views are different, why I am in the free software movement rather than the open source movement, is that I believe there's something more important at stake, that freedom to cooperate with other people, freedom to have a community is important for our quality of life. It's important for having a good society that we can live in, and that is, in my view, even more important than having powerful and reliable software. You know, when I was a kid and I went to school, the teachers were trying to teach us to share. They said if you bring some candy, you can't eat it all yourself, you've got to share it with the other kids. But now the administration says teachers should be teaching kids to say yes to licensing. If you bring some software to school, oh no, don't share it. Sharing means you're a pirate. Sharing means you'll be put in jail. That's not the way society should work. We need the goodwill, the willingness to help other people, at least when it's not too hard, because that's the basis of society. That's the fundamental resource that gives us a society instead of a dog-eat-dog jungle.
So what about people that say that if you have rampant piracy, it will eliminate the profit motive, and then in the creative works, software will not be?
Well, they're wrong on both counts. For one thing, people are making a profit from developing free software, but for another, the freedom to have a community is more important.
I invite Richard Stallman, who's the founder of the Free Software Association, and Tim Ney, who's the managing director. There we go.
Here it is.
Now, Richard, I saw you playing your recorder in Paris at that Linux conference, but I didn't have an audio track. So would you get them to add audio to their video downstream next time?
I don't have any control over that. Unfortunately, those things can only be done with non-free software.
Okay. All right. We'll give you the award. And before you say a word, we'll have Tim and yourself hold up a little representation of the contribution towards the Free Software Association.
So, very ironic things have happened, but nothing to match this. Giving the Linus Torvalds Award to the Free Software Foundation is sort of like giving the Han Solo Award to the Rebel Fleet. You see, some of you may not realize how far that analogy goes. But actually, let me tell you how we got here. See, what happened is, 15 years ago, if you wanted to use a computer, the only way you could do it was with proprietary software that divides and subjugates the users. And most people a lot of people didn't like it, but they saw no alternative. But some of us were determined to make an alternative, and we said, we're going to develop a free operating system, a free software operating system that will give users the chance to have freedom while they use their computers. Now, a lot of people said, well, it's a nice idea, but it's so hard, we'll never get it done, so I don't want to participate. I don't believe you can ever get it done. But luckily, not everybody said that. And clearly, we knew we would eventually get the kernel done. But as it happens, somebody else did a better kernel before we did. Now, in the old days, we had an overall strategy for calling people's attention to the importance of freedom, to the freedom that they can have or not have when they use a computer. Well, what can we do about it? As far as I can tell, the only workable way of trying to change this and make that strategy work again is to spread the word that the operating system you're using is actually the GNU system, somewhat modified, of course. And when people know this, they'll take a look at the reasons we developed this system, they'll think about these issues, and some of them will decide they agree. So I ask people, please tell people this is the GNU system. It's the combination of GNU and Linux, so we can call it GNU/Linux.
So how do you feel about potentially billions of dollars of wealth being created from your creation, but you're not necessarily directly cashing out?
So if I hadn't made Linux available, I mean, I wouldn't have gotten any money that way either. So I mean, it's a win-win situation. Just the fact that there are a lot of commercial companies means that there are a lot of Linux people who used to work on Linux kind of on the side. And now they get paid for doing what they wanted to do. And that helps me in the sense that I wanted them to work on Linux anyway.
The whole GNU project is really one big hack. It's one big act of subversive, playful cleverness to change society for the better, because I'm only interested in changing it for the better, but in a clever way.